The most effective thing you can do to spur long-term consumption is with the household registration system and with social services. And I guess lastly, just anything you can do to raise wages, right? To give people more take-home pay.
Hello, my name is Lizzi Lee, a fellow on Chinese economy at the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. On behalf of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, I'm pleased to talk with Scott Kennedy, Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic International Studies, about the recently concluded Third Plenum and its implications for China's economy going forward. Scott, let's kick things off with the decision to postpone the Third Plenum. This meeting, typically held every 5 years, was delayed by several months. What do you think prompted this delay? Was it mainly about the state of China's economy, or were there significant internal debates within the CCP that influenced this decision?
Well, Lizzie, thanks for having this conversation with me. It's great to be here with you under the auspices of the National Committee. And I'm a big fan of everything that the Center for China Analysis at ASPE does. So great to have this conversation. I think the honest answer is we don't know. We don't know why this meeting was held in mid-July of 2024 instead of November of 2023. We could speculate. It very well could be, the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping's leadership has broken a lot of taboos and does things very differently. He's now serving in his third term. Previous leaders served 2 terms. Typically, they would have meetings once a year, plenum once a year, but they've spaced them out and changed the timing of them. They've had other meetings. There was also the pandemic, which threw things off for a while. The party recently published a article describing how the decision was drafted that was issued at the plenum. That's the core document of what they debated. And actually, it appears that drafting for that document began in November. And it went through apparently 38 drafts, lots of different meetings, and was finally, put together in close to final form just a few weeks ago. So if it's a long document, it has lots of different components, and there's plenty for experts to disagree about if they want to. And they don't come down squarely on a lot of things, which might think, well, maybe there's still debates about these things, or just maybe they just wanted to, they thought maybe 17,700 words was enough. And but we don't know exactly why the meeting was held now instead of a year ago or 9 months ago. But nevertheless, for China watchers like myself and you, we finally got to the meeting. We finally got to see what they produced, and we have a lot to talk about.
Right. Now that the plenum has wrapped up, what's your overall impression of the communique and resolution? Were there any surprises, or was it mostly in line with your expectations?
Well, China's economy has not been doing great the last few years, right? And the country has been buffeted by international tensions. It grew quite quickly after the global financial crisis, but then has gradually slowed down over the last decade. It's had challenges in its housing market a few times with the foreign exchange, stock market. Certainly the trade war, the pandemic, growing tensions in the Taiwan Strait and Ukraine, et cetera, have generated more tensions and anxieties. And there's a big sense of anxiety and uncertainty amongst folks in China and externally as well. So there was some hope, I think, that in light of these very serious problems, there might be a adjustment to the strategy and an effort to provide reassurance to those in China's private sector, households, Western governments, that things might proceed differently. And I think what we got instead was a continuity, but a promise to try much, much harder, to do everything that they could to make this strategy that they've been implementing for the last few years work. Now, their view is that it's already achieved a lot of success, and you can point to electric vehicles and high-speed rail and solar panels, batteries, et cetera, as proof of success. And certainly China is still growing, not as fast as it was before, but it's still growing. And China today looks very different than China 40 years ago, just physically 100% change. But nevertheless, I think many folks watching, after they read the decision, will think, they're going to do the same. They're going to try harder, but they're likely to encounter many of the same kinds of problems that they've encountered recently. And I think there could be some skepticism around the dinner tables of private entrepreneurs and investment houses. It'll take a little bit of time to see, but I could see why they might be skeptical given how the decision was framed and what it discussed.
Right. And that naturally leads to my next question. In your recent foreign policy article, I believe you mentioned several reasons why the Chinese leadership might not be addressing China's economic challenges more aggressively. Reasons like ignorance, indecisiveness, disinterest, or simply disagreement with critics. Given these possibilities, which one do you find most convincing now, especially after seeing the outcomes of the Third Plenum?
Well, what I was trying to do in that piece was not put down a list of my views about why China's economic policy is heading in the direction it's heading, but what I've heard from people speculating, mostly inside China, but outside China too, about the direction of economic policy. And, again, people have different views, and it's interesting to compare and contrast people's different evaluations. But many of them still come down worried, deeply concerned about the trajectory of economic policy. I guess my own view is does the leadership have all the information that we'd want it to have? I don't know. I wish they'd read all of CSIS's reports, or everything from CCA and from participants in the National Committee's Public Intellectuals program and everything else, and then make policy decisions after having gone over our stuff. I think they probably actually have quite a bit of information, and a lot of information that none of us have. Are these issues difficult to solve? Are there conflicts of interest? Is China a big place? Gosh darn sure it is. All those things. None of this is easy. But I think at the end of the day, this China's going in the direction that its leadership wants it to go in. My sense is if you not just read the speeches of the leadership, but if you look at the detailed policy that they've implemented and defended in domestic audiences, international audiences, there's a lot of consistency in what they're saying and what they're doing. And they really believe that it's the responsibility of the Chinese Communist Party to direct economic actors and to steer the economy on what they think is the right path. Not because they think that would always be the most ideal thing to do, but because it's a dangerous world. Change is unforeseen in 100 years. Pressures coming from all different directions. Also, a technological revolution, which markets may not pick up on and need the state to guide them to invest significantly. So it's not necessarily that these are folks who favor using state power all the time, but in the current circumstances that China exists in, they come down heavily in favor of using state power. They don't say don't use markets. They're not going back to a planned economy like the 1960s, the Mao era, but the market is a tool that can be used in certain circumstances, including by the state, to achieve specific kinds of goals. And when it doesn't work, when it fails, the state needs to step in and direct activity and get the kind of outcomes that they want. There's also a heavy emphasis on technology, that a firm belief that China needs to be the inventor, innovator of the technologies of the future, and that is the best way to ensure growth long term. China for a long time was assembling everyone else's technology, not making much money from doing so. And their view is that most of that value added and the benefits of the economy come when you are the creators of those technologies. It's not a crazy idea, but a lot of people think there's many other important sources of growth besides technology. China's also emphasized that it's really important to balance economics and national security because they see a dangerous world. And that's why you see in China And in this decision, the discussion about the need for supply chain resilience. In fact, you see a conversation in Beijing in this decision that isn't totally unfamiliar to folks who work in Washington, D.C., Tokyo, Berlin, London, Brussels, where resilience is the talk of the town, talk of the world. And you see that in China as well. And so, although China has probably moved in a more statist direction than many others, the whole spectrum has shifted. China's at one end of that spectrum.
Well, thank you for sharing that insight. As you alluded to, the third plenum really reinforced a focus on supply side strategies, particularly in advanced manufacturing and technology. How do you see this affecting trade tensions with the US and EU? And what are the potential benefits and drawbacks of maintaining a supply side focus?
It is easier to move companies and producers to act than it is households. And when you think that it's really important to be in control of your destiny, and that comes through controlling these technologies, then that's where you're going to put your money. And China's political economy is really oriented around assisting producers. It has less skill at motivating and in an enduring way the decisions of households. And so you've seen this great attention to advanced technologies. And in the decision, they directly list the key ones they want to support. Advanced information technologies, which basically means semiconductors, semiconductor equipment, AI, aviation and aerospace, new energy, new materials, robotics, and other advanced equipment, biomedicine, quantum. These are the technologies which you also hear talked about in many other places. I think that the challenge will be is the Chinese government, the Communist Party, local governments will act like venture capitalists, and they are going to continue to chuck a ton of money at all of these sectors and others. Some of that will bear fruit, and some of it will not. In fact, a lot of it will not. China's doing great in electric vehicles, right? They dominate in batteries, and that's the whole supply chain. But you've got maybe 5 of 150 EV companies that are profitable in China. And you've got capacity utilization rate down now below 65% in autos in China. And without a big bump in domestic consumption, you've seen a big increase in exports. Those are high quality cars. I've seen Chinese EV factories and battery factories up close. Anyone who's walked a minute on a street in China is impressed. But there's too many. And this is a political economy that can generate, as a recurring problem, too much production. And a lot of that is being exported. So that's the downside of this model, is that it could take away space for other competitors who should make these things, who don't have the deep reserves of funding to do so. On the upside, some of these technologies are really important for the green transition. Right? And why not use China's subsidization of the green transition to transition? And so I think actually there is going to be a long-term policy dilemma for countries around the world where China's that use the power of the state and the competitiveness of its companies to scale up and export and serve the domestic market and grow more quickly than the global market does. For the moment, right now, the policymakers elsewhere are deciding that China's advances are primarily viewed through a competition lens, not through a public good lens. And so I think that's going to generate more tensions, and we're seeing that in Washington and Brussels and Brasilia and other places. And then there's also the national security side of advanced technologies, because many of these are inherently dual use. So the key to addressing those dilemmas is, one, winding back a little bit some of the state intervention in these industries, and two, finding a way to reduce tensions with the West, the United States, and others. Everybody's got responsibility in the increased tensions. Certainly, policies that have been adopted in Washington and other capitals have generated tensions. But what the Chinese are doing have also contributed to those. Everybody's got to share in the responsibility. Everybody's got to share in the solution. This decision, I think, suggests that, at least for the time being, Beijing doesn't believe it is responsible for the economic tensions that have been created. And so I think we're going to continue to see those economic tensions increase.
Despite the focus on security and technology, as you mentioned, the communique and the resolution did mention actively expanding domestic demand. And we know consumer spending is still pretty sluggish as of now. Do you see any targeted measures that the leadership could implement to stimulate domestic demands? And what are they looking like to you now?
Sure. The weight of the decision focuses on producers, but it doesn't totally ignore consumers and households. You're right about that. I recall 3 specific areas that they touch upon that could be directly relevant for households and consumption. And also, we should know that there has been some rebound in non-real estate related consumption the last year in retail sales. It is really, it's the housing market that is still stuck, and folks are not buying and selling properties. But even other consumption is still not back to where it could be. And so there's still the overall, how do you, in the short term and long term, generate sufficient consumer demand? I think they touch upon at least 3 areas. The first is trying to reform China's household registration system, the hukou system, to make it possible for those born in the countryside in rural China to move to cities, work in cities, and live permanently in cities and enjoy the services that those cities provide, from education to healthcare and everything else. Right now, most rural migrants aren't assured that they're going to have access to those kinds of services or high quality services. So they save extra because every day is a rainy day for them. So reforming the hukou system would give them the freedom and the opportunity to spend more of their earnings. In addition to that, you've also seen the decision talk about the need to reform China's financial system and fiscal system. And that might allow local governments and maybe the central government in certain places to invest more in healthcare services, pensions, other elements of the social safety net, which again, currently, Chinese households save up for. Chinese have a 45% savings rate. Like the US savings rate is almost negative, is very, very low. I'm not saying that the Chinese should have savings rates as low as Americans, but it's too high. And they are saving their money for a rainy day because they don't have these foundations. So the hukou system, reform of financial system, more spending on social services could generate more consumption. The last is, I think this decision says, let's also find ways to provide incentives for consumption on high priority products like electric vehicles. And so tax credits, sales tax rebates, the kind of things that are being used in EVs, use them towards other types of household appliances, other types of technologies. My guess is that this third kind of tool, which fits China's political economy, is probably going to be the least effective. That the most effective thing you can do to spur long-term consumption is with the household registration system and with social services. And I guess lastly, just anything you can do to raise wages, right? To give people more take-home pay. Those things would raise consumption over the long term. I don't think that this decision goes far enough. And I don't think we're going to see a rebalancing of wealth from industry and companies to the direction of households as a result of this. But that's what's needed. These individual things will be interesting to measure, but I would be curious if 5 years out in 2029, when they say these reforms are supposed to be fully implemented, if the share of consumption in China's GDP is any higher than it is right now.
Well, thank you for the insight. As you know, this week, a group of U.S. executives from companies like Goldman Sachs, Starbucks, and Nike are in Beijing to get firsthand insights following the plenum. What do you think these business leaders are hoping to achieve in their discussions with Chinese officials?
My guess is that American companies and other foreign investors who are watching China, first and foremost, want to know if China's economic policy strategy is going to be effective at addressing the challenges of the economy as a whole. Will this strategy raise productivity? Will it address China's mounting debt? Is there a strategy to deal with China's shrinking and graying population? Will China be able to reduce tensions with the rest of the world, which seems to be so anxious that we're seeing signs of diversification, if not decoupling? I think that's the first thing that they're going to be looking at and wanting to hear more about. I think the second thing is then they're just going to look at market access issues in their own industries. What are the opportunities for foreign financial institutions in China, in manufacturing, in services where there's been more restrictions than in other places? I think thirdly, they're going to be looking for to what extent will the competition with Chinese companies in third markets be on a level playing field? Or to what extent will China use its economic, diplomatic power, its industrial policy to change the landscape elsewhere? I think these are the top three things I would imagine that global business leaders are looking at and will be asking when they're in China. And I think the answers that they get will be important in how they decide whether they're going to continue to invest in China, diversify partly away from China, how they'll act in third markets, the kind of advice they will provide to their home governments on how what's the best way to deal with China.
Fantastic. Speaking of narratives, state media Xinhua recently portrayed Xi Jinping as a staunch supporter of the private sector. How does this narrative match up with what you observe as actual experience of private enterprises in China? And how can Beijing restore investor confidence at this point?
Most of China's economy is in the hands of private companies. The vast majority of new investment, new jobs, new innovations come from China's private sector. Xi Jinping previously served in Fujian, in Zhejiang, two provinces with a high proportion of private companies, very successful. So he's seen firsthand from his time in the provinces, private companies succeed. And I'm sure since he's been back in Beijing since the mid 2000s when he served as vice president, and since he's taken over as general secretary of the party and president, he's continued to see this. And certainly, I don't think that the goal of the party's policies is to dissuade private investment, to have private companies fail, to have foreign companies fail. But I think in addition to watching China's economy and commercial behavior, China's leadership is also looking at issues of domestic stability, international security, and also the source of public goods and addressing challenges which private companies may not on their own have incentive enough to spend. And so I think he's been looking to balance the promotion of the private sector with the need, in their view, to continue to promote state-owned enterprises, which provide a variety of economic and political and security benefits from the party's perspective. As a result of trying to balance those two things, you see an ebb and flow of, at times, extensive support for the private sector, and other times pulling things back. The leadership has gone back and forth on this a few times, and if you read the decision, what you find is a great deal of support and emphasis for state-owned enterprises. The private sector and private companies are mentioned, and the decision says there should be a level playing field and equality of opportunity, and more sectors open to private firms. On the other hand, it reads more like a defense of the importance of state-owned sector than a full-throated support of private industry. And so I think that's where we are in China right now. If this plan, as it's written down, yields a lot of success and a rebound in growth and a rebound in private investment, that balance will have worked out well. We'll have to see how companies react.
Fabulous. One last question, Scott. What do you think are the broader implications of the plenum for the US-China relationship beyond business and economic concerns?
Well, I think there are probably 2 or 3 important implications of the decision for US-China relations. The first is just to drive home the strategy China is using now and has been using is the strategy that they're going to be using. Anybody who thought that they were unintentionally going down this road of the party state providing significant leadership and steerage of the economy, that's wrong. This is the direction they want to go in. They believe it for economic, political, national security reasons, and they're heading that way. My view is that this is a significant change from the reform and opening era, when the US and China had a more stable relationship. There were less tensions because there was less of a systemic difference between our economies, and those systemic differences that did exist could be managed without requiring full-scale harmonization and equality. But it doesn't look like China is moving in that direction. In fact, it looks like it's moving in a different direction. And so I think that the first thing is that this decision reinforces that conclusion. I think that the second is China is really aiming to be a world power in the most important technologies that everyone is working on. And the US and the rest of the world, if they want to be leaders, they're going to have to up their game. Doesn't necessarily mean up your game by the way the Chinese are doing it, because it's just one approach. And China's had some successes, but also plenty of failures. But it means that we're seeing that there's going to be more pressure on others to produce results in these technologies and other places as well. And I think third, it puts a premium on the need for there to be extensive, comprehensive dialogue between the US and China. Government policymakers, scholars, business people. This is a very complex, tenuous time for China, for the United States, for the global economy. We're facing a whole variety of challenges: political, economic, social, physical. If you just look at the temperature gauge outside around much of the world, addressing these problems in a way that does not spill over into open conflict in ways that do not hurt our publics is going to require greater diplomacy now more than ever. I'm very worried about the direction of policies in many places. Hopefully, diplomacy, properly utilized, can reduce and manage some of these tensions and perhaps help policymakers make adjustments where they otherwise wouldn't, where they could possibly be reassured or learn new things. So I think that means that the National Committee on US-China Relations and the Asia Society, CSIS, universities, businesses are going to have to up their games as diplomats as well. And hopefully the Chinese will be there willing to engage with us across the board on these issues. So the decision is a major turning point in China, but it's not the end of the conversation. Hopefully it'll be the beginning of a new wave of conversations.
Thank you so much, Scott. We have unfortunately run out of time, but thank you so much for sharing your insights. I would also like to thank the National Committee staff who, behind the scenes, helped to make this interview possible. If you enjoyed it, we hope you will return for future National Committee programs. Thank you.